Okay, I'm recording. Hey, this is Stephan Kinsella. This is going to be probably Kinsella on Liberty 457. I'm sitting outside today. As people listening to the show know, I don't usually do my own podcasts, but on occasion I do. And Sheldon Richman is my old buddy, and we were talking, and I thought we would catch up, and I would just kind of talk to you about your history of your IP views. And then there's another guy I was talking to, and I'll let you introduce yourself in a second. There's another guy I was talking to, a guy from Brazil who had some questions, and I thought I was going to talk to him, but maybe he'll join us in 30 minutes. So Sheldon, most people listening probably know who you are. You're an old timer in the movement, well known. What are you doing now? And give a brief introduction of yourself.
Well, I am the executive editor of the Libertarian Institute, which is I don't know how many years old it now is. It can't be getting too far from its 10th anniversary, which is mainly a website and book publisher that was organized primarily by Scott Horton, but I and Will Grigg, the late Will Grigg, were involved in the initial setup. We were like the three main people beginning the thing, but I think that the heavy work was really done by Scott. And so it's a website. He's added lots of authors to it. So every day there are new articles as well as reposts. I write a weekly column every Friday, which is my TGIF column, which stands for The Goal is Freedom, which is actually a column that goes way back to my days as editor of the Freeman back in the late 90s up to about, 2012 or 13. I was the editor of the Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. And so this is a column I've carried along in a few different organizations, and plus my own blog called Free Association, where I comment on the news or sometimes economic theory, anything I feel like writing about that's somewhat related to libertarianism, Austrian economics, things like that. So I did whatever.
And is this sort of like is it like your full-time job? Are you retired or?
Well, I said, look, officially I'm retired. I'm certainly past the official retirement age. So yeah, I'm not working full time, and I don't really have to account for my time to anyone, but I do some freelancing. For tax purposes, I'm going to report every year a good bit of 1099 income, which has always been true, but I'm still doing that. So yes, I still am making money through my labor.
And you and I have known each other a long time.
I won't say I own my labor because I know you have a problem with
that. Well, and I think maybe a lot of some people, I used to think of you as a left libertarian, but I don't know if you changed or if I just had that wrong, because you've never been quite a left libertarian.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because that's something I've been indicating in writings, although more implicitly than explicitly. I was using that term in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And to me, though, I always regarded it as a matter of emphasis, not a different ideology, really. So my views have not changed. But first of all, I won't use that term because it's not understood.
Right.
And I don't think right and left are understood. They're like Rorschach tests. I really like the book. I really like the book by those two brothers, the Lewis brothers, Myth of Left. What's it called? The Myth of Left and Right. And so they're pretty useless terms. I'm not a tribalist. So I'm just a liberty advocate, a libertarian. I'll call myself a full classical liberal. I use terms like that. But
I've never been a lefty or righty. I came from nothing. I wasn't conservative or anything, and I just became a libertarian. I've always thought the terms were useless because the right, in my simplistic Randian days, I thought the right was just kind of a hodgepodge of incoherent. I mean, what does it mean to be conservative? You conserve what, And then the left, I thought the left was sort of like just partial socialists. They're moderate socialists. They're socialist light.
Yeah.
But
I call it moderate communists.
Right. But Hoppe had something where he said, it appeals to me a little bit. He said that basically the right, at least among libertarians, are what he calls realistic. And by that, I think he means having no problem recognizing the necessity for and the reality of differences between people and hierarchies, which is anti-egalitarian. Yeah. And then the left is more egalitarian, like thinking like the ideal state or the natural state is everyone to be equal, but I don't know what that means to be equal, except from a libertarian point of view of having equal rights.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that distinction makes any sense to you, but
Well, when I was using the term left libertarian, what I wanted to do there was speak to any good faith leftist status, assuming those terms have meaning, right? For sake of discussion, and try to argue to them. Now, you could accuse me of naivete, and I'll plead guilty to it. Try to argue to them that what you want is what the free market delivers, because consumers, and I would quote Mises all over the place. I love Ludwig von Mises. I regard myself as an Austrian. What I tried to sell to the left was, you say you want, quote, social control of the means of production. Mises shows that if the people who legally and politically own the means of production, if they don't satisfy consumers, the consumers are going to find other owners, right? Through bankruptcy, through purely uncoordinated, not at a big mass meeting, but just through their abstaining from buying, they are going to shift the ownership and control of the means of production to people that they hope will better serve them, and then do the same thing if those people don't serve them. Well, no leftist was going to buy that, and I say no doesn't mean you can't find, surely somebody maybe would be convinced by that, but by and large they're not. They hate the market. I think it's very much an aesthetic aversion to the market, not just political, not just ethical. I think it's a matter of aesthetics that these moderate socialists, moderate communists don't like markets. I mean, Chomsky thinks that what he calls renting labor is almost as bad as owning other people's labor, as slavery.
yeah,
It's just a little half step from slavery for him, and that's so immoral. It's so immoral. It's so immoral that position, that I can't believe it. So the term doesn't communicate. I won't say I'm not a left libertarian.
do you think that some of these modern kind of, I won't say right libertarians, but these sort of the prepper types and the ones that want to grow their own chickens and things, I mean, they're a little bit anti-capitalist too, in a sense, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta, it depends on what we're talking about. I don't have anybody in particular in mind. I'm sure you're going to find some of that. The other thing that I never really fully bought into, I didn't really buy into, I shouldn't say fully bought into, with left libertarianism was, and not every left libertarian does this, but there was the prediction that in a pure free market, the free market that both you and I want, higher, it relates to something you said, companies would have less hierarchy or even like flatten, and that more and more people would own their own businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And well, it's quite possible that more people would own their own businesses if government got out of the way, but tons of people don't want to own a business. First of all, small businesses fail at a very high rate. It's a big headache. You probably have a lot of sleepless nights when you own a business. You don't go home at 5 o'clock. I think a lot of people want to be employees.
Yeah.
We have to proudly say that. And that's a good mutual exchange, voluntary exchange. And this is what you find in Mises and Rothbard and all the people that praise the marketplace. So those predictions never made me comfortable that big businesses would disappear. I don't buy that. I think there'd be national companies. I think there'd be international companies, because entrepreneurs would find a way. If the government hadn't built interstate highways, entrepreneurs would have figured it out, because there's just such gains to be made. And we would have had globalization if the government, without the government helping it along. Entrepreneurs do that. I recently wrote an article in praise of, it's called corporate is not a 4-letter word. You notice how people use the word corporate as a pejorative? The corporate media. Now that media may be bad because that's the old line legacy media. But what's bad about them is not that they're organized as corporations. It's because they parrot the government's line or other reasons. Not because it's not qua corporation that we should dislike them. So I defended the corporation, and the basis of my article was Robert Hessen's 1979 book in praise of the corporation, who was a very hardcore free market guy. He wasn't an
in,
anarchist.
in defense of the corporation. And
Yeah.
didn't you do an interview? Was it you that had an interview with was it Bob Murphy or someone about you were
He did an interview
defending?
with me. Murphy interviewed me.
Yeah, right. He interviewed you about your
Murphy
views
was
on.
calling it the corporate media, and I contacted
Right,
him
right,
and said,
right.
"Why
right.
do you do that?" I did it. I tried to do it with some other people too, like what's his name, John Popola, and also I also brought it to the attention of Michael Malice, but he didn't go for it.
Well, I do similar. I do similar things like that. Like, well, first of all, corporate form is just one form of business organization. It's not. There's nothing special about it. People don't understand these things. Same thing with intellectual property. They use the word intellectual property to refer to my IP to mean their ideas, but IP is an intellectual right that is different than the subject of it. I even try to when I can be careful to distinguish state from government, because government is ambiguous because it can just mean the institutions of governance, which could be private law and courts. So the way I look at it is the state is a distinct entity, and the state has monopolized certain functions, including the function of governance, just like it's monopolized education and roads. But those things are not naturally part of the state. They just happen to be monopolized by the state.
I think you've influenced Murphy on that. I think government is too much. For too long has been used as a synonym for the state.
That's my point, right?
So I wouldn't call it. I don't mind talking about governance,
right,
and also saying what I mean by that. But I wouldn't distinguish government and state. Albert J. Nock, the great Albert J. Nock, wrote the book Our Enemy of the State, 1935, and he distinguished government from state. And he was thinking of really Jeffersonian, very local.
Right. Well, it's just semantics in a way, but it's sometimes important to get them straight. But the other reason is in our federalist system in America, you have these libertarian centralists like the Cato types. I don't know where you stand on that. I assume you're pretty sensible about federalism and all this and enumerated powers of the federal government. But when you just talk like a Randian or like a centralist and you say the government shouldn't do this, it's like, well, which government do you mean? Because often they mean a state law is bad, but that means the federal government has the right by its courts to strike down these bad laws. So they mix the two types of government together by using the word government.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wouldn't share your characterization of Cato. First of all, there are a lot of different people at Cato.
Well, I'm thinking specifically of Roger Pilon and Randy Burnett, who's not really there, and Kimberly Shankman, and the guys that want to expand the interpretation of the 14th Amendment.
So they're against. You're saying they're against the 10th Amendment? Or they want to pretend it's not there?
Well, no, but they think that the 14th Amendment did give the federal government broad supervisory power through the Privileges and Immunities Clause to basically review state laws for being kind of unlibertarian in a way, right? So it's kind of that. So they actually viewed the 14th Amendment as granting a power to the feds to review state laws.
Yeah, well, I certainly am not an expert in that. I haven't had a law education as you have and many people have. So yeah, I'm not really up on the technical things there. I do. First of all, state governments, as we know from Jonathan R.T. Hughes, The Governmental Habit, that states always did a lot of regulating and things that libertarians wouldn't like. So we shouldn't assume the states are going to be much better. When Patrick Henry, and this is in my book about the Constitution, when Patrick Henry first read a draft of the Constitution, which of course he didn't like, he was a anti-federalist, he said, "This leaves nothing to the states but building the roads and taking care of the poor."
Right.
That means the states at the time were building the roads and taking care of the poor. Why would he say that otherwise? So they were hardly havens of laissez-faire.
Oh, I know. That's my point. But the point is, the states had plenary power, like most states in the world do. They have plenary power. Plenary meaning full legislative power. They can legislate on whatever they want unless there's a limitation. But the federal government, and there's some other, I used to think it was only the US, but there are some other, like Switzerland and Australia, I think, and even Canada. Those federal governments don't have plenary power. Now, they have way broader legislative power than the US government does, but they still don't have complete power because they have a provincial system.
And our states all have constitutions, not that I'm an expert.
Correct, but it doesn't grant them the power to legislate. It limits their power to legislate.
Yeah, but here's another point about the national constitution. when Madison is considered the since in what is it, Federalist 10, he talks about the powers are few and defined of the federal government, few and defined in the Constitution. However, I think there's something dishonest about that.
Mm-hmm.
He might have meant it at the time because that was in the Federalist Papers before the Constitution was ratified. But when he was pushing the Bill of Rights, because he was the primary mover of those amendments that became the Bill of Rights, because he had promised there would be a Bill of Rights. When what became the 10th Amendment, although at the time it was the 12th, because there were others that didn't get picked.
One of them is now the 27th. Yeah.
But so the one we call the 10th, it says that something about all powers not delegated to the federal government. And Thomas Tudor Tucker, this is in my book too, in the Constitution, I'll do a plug. Who was a congressman, a member of the House from, I believe, South Carolina, and stood up, proposed an amendment. He wanted to change it to all powers not expressly delegated. Madison, this was in the committee. Madison opposed it. Arguing all constitutions have to have powers by implication. Madison was the father, or at least a subscriber to the implied powers doctrine. That's not his reputation today. And when it got to the full House, he made the same objection and beat it. So it would have been a better amendment if it had said expressly.
Well, but you still have the necessary and proper clause, which people like Randy Barnett and others have said, well, that does give more power to the necessary and proper clause also. And you made another point. Every now and then I'll write something like things I've changed my mind on, because I like to try to be honest. And like I've changed my mind on intellectual property. I've changed my mind on anarchy over the years. And you kind of changed my mind on something, I think, related to what you said here, if I'm remembering right. You had the point that a lot of libertarians say something like, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, which is kind of a stupid semantic argument. I mean, we do have, it's a combination, but we also say something like, well, the federal government doesn't have broad legislative powers. The Interstate Commerce Clause, which the government has used to justify broad federal legislative power, was never meant to be a broad grant of power. And I think you had a point that, well, it kind of was, or it was arguably that way, right? Like they kind of hid that they sold it one way, but it really could be read to be much broader than we.
That's in my book too. These were originally that book on the Constitution that I wrote. It's called The Constitution Revisited. It's called America's Counter-Revolution: The Constitution Revisited. Those were originally articles in the Freeman. Amazingly, I actually published those all in the Freeman, and I forget the name of the scholar I was drawing on, because you and I had exchanges on that.
And you changed my mind on that.
That list was not limits to Congress's power. Article in Section 8. It was simply, for instance, it's as if it had said, for example, here's what Congress can do. It wasn't like this is all Congress can do, and he made a pretty good argument, which I found persuasive.
Now, I as an anarchist, I don't want to argue that, and as a realist and as a skeptic and a cynic of positive law, I kind of tend to agree with John Hasnas in his criticism of the rule of law, at least when it applies to legislation and artificial laws like the Constitution, that there's really no objective meaning quite often in these things. So you could argue for an interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause that doesn't give the federal government as much legislative power as they have now, and I would argue that in court, and I would argue that that's a defensible interpretation. But still, I think your point was good. But let me ask you this: so, how long would you say you've been a libertarian?
Oh, shortly before 1970, so probably about 68. The Goldwater campaign in '64 got me thinking about politics. I had an older brother who was not a libertarian, but he was interested in Goldwater. So that's the first time I was ever thinking about politics. So I think I read The Conscience of a Conservative, but then I was still in high school, or maybe I was even in junior high school. I was 14 in '64. I was born at the end of the first full year of Harry Truman's own term, right? He succeeded Roosevelt, but then he ran in '48. I was born at the end of '49. So that just to locate me on the timeline. So '64, I was 14. I was interested in Goldwater. I wasn't thinking about foreign policy, which of course was not very good, but I liked his idea about individual liberty and government's supposed to be limited. That sounded great. Then when we get to like 67, 68, I'm meeting classmates who are saying, well, if you like that, you ought to read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And, from there, you're just down the slippery slope, right?
And how old were you then?
Well, in 1968, I was 18. So I was,
okay.
I was already at, in 67, I started college at Temple University in Philadelphia. So that would be the fall of 67. I was 17, going on 18.
And what were you political before then, or like a conservative, or lefty?
Well, I hadn't heard the word libertarian, so I probably considered myself a conservative because I like Goldwater.
Okay, you're a conservative. Okay, hold on a second.
But I didn't know the word.
Hold on a second. So I just allowed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce real quickly Andre, who's a friend, an internet friend, libertarian from Brazil. Andre, can you say hello?
Hello. How are you?
Hi. I don't know if you can leave your video, like you can turn your video on or leave it off. It's up to you. Sheldon and I are talking, and I'm just going to keep going over some things with him, and then hi. And when we're ready to get Pat to the IP issue, we'll talk about the things you and I were chatting about previously. Okay?
No problem.
So Sheldon, I don't know. Do you know Sheldon?
No. Hello. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Okay, so let me just continue with Sheldon for a while. I'm just going over his background and history in the movement. So Sheldon, you were kind of Goldwater, and then around 18, you got interested in
about 67 or 68, I start hearing this word libertarian. In college, I then in Philadelphia was a hotbed for libertarians who were still in YAF because they hadn't split from YAF yet, the Young Americans for Freedom, which was a conservative William Buckley founded group. But
and that's all detailed in that great Jerome to Chile book, right? It usually begins with Ayn Rand.
But some of the main libertarians in YAF were in Philadelphia, so I quickly met them. They had an office downtown, and before you know it, I'm reading Rand and Rothbard and Mises, and so I was just already in there.
What were you doing? Were you from Philly, or what were you doing in Philly?
No, I was from Philly. I was born and raised Northeast Philadelphia.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I think I told you I lived in
very
Philly
democratic neighborhood. Very Jewish democratic neighborhood. My parents were the rare Republican Jews in Northeast Philadelphia.
Well, I think I told you we lived in Philly for 97 to 98, and I enjoyed it. We lived in, what's that?
I forgot that. Where in Philly?
Well, I worked at Dwayne Morris and Schneider Harrison, these two law firms in the city, but my wife and I lived in Newtown Square in Delaware County.
Yeah.
And it's just the western suburbs there are just beautiful. I love my drive to the train station every morning, but I had enough of Philly after about 3 years. I was ready to return to the South. They're not as welcoming to outsiders as people in Houston are, put it that way. That was the impression I got, but I did like it. So you went, did you complete college and all that?
Yeah, did 4 years on time. Graduated in 71, went to work as a newspaper reporter in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which was right near York County.
I lived there first, in Chester, then we moved
and worked there, worked as a reporter. I worked for the Associated Press briefly. I didn't like it very much. That was in downtown Philly. And then gave up reporting, got tired of it after about 6 or 7 years, spent a year editing, being a consultant to companies on editing of technical papers. I was part of a small firm that went in and taught people how to do effective writing. Like, for example, we'd go to the DuPont company where chemists needed to write clear reports for salespeople who were not chemists. So we were teaching really intelligent people who knew their stuff, but who couldn't write clearly, how to write. I did that for about a year, and then I got a call from Charles Koch, believe it or not. I was living in Delaware. Oh, because I also worked for the Delaware News Journal for a bit. And then I get a call saying, we're starting a new organization called the Council for a Competitive Economy. And we'd like you to come down and be the director of research. David Bose was part of this. He was starting to organize it. They didn't even have an office yet. And I said, well, gosh, I'll come down for the summer and try it out. And if I like it, I'll stay. And he said, that's fine, because I had the summer off from this writing course thing. And I liked it, so I stayed. And but I was a call from Charles Koch.
No. Now, so, and I got into libertarianism in college. Well, actually in high school, but it really started writing and stuff in like around around my law years. And of course I got into intellectual property. And as you know, my impression is that the early libertarian movement sort of ignored or took the intellectual property issue for granted. And most of them were in favor of it, partly because like it was just assumed to be part of the Constitution and capitalism, and Ayn Rand was in favor of it. And I was initially in favor because I read Ayn Rand, and until I started questioning it and developed my views. And then, so my impression is that the movement was roughly agnostic about it, except for that brief period in the late 1800s with Benjamin Tucker and the guys arguing in the magazine Liberty, the old magazine Liberty, which Wendy McElroy's written a lot about. There was a brief, but then it sort of faded. And then I think that then you had basically Tom Palmer started in the 1889 in 1989 started writing about scarcity and that kind of stuff, and being anti-IP, and then the copy wrongs guy Conkin and Wendy McElroy, and then me and Roderick Long, and then Jeff Tucker and others started joining in. And
can I do a quick timeout?
Yeah,
we are 3 pipe smokers.
Yeah, I
see Andre smoking a pipe. Okay,
that's
back to our regularly scheduled program.
I'll just talk to Andre while you go. Would you need to refresh your pipe?
No, because I'm in my apartment. I don't smoke in the apartment.
What do you want to do?
Oh, no, I don't want to do anything. I just wanted to, I broke in to make that point. Now I'm back.
Oh, I thought you would have taken time out. Sorry.
No, so you're absolutely right. First of all, we should mention Lysander Spooner, who was a very hardcore defender of IP.
Yes.
In the middle of the 19th century, unlike Tucker, who loved Spooner, but he didn't agree with Spooner on this, because Tucker was not a natural rights person anyway.
Yes.
But I first heard, so I never heard an anti-IP word in those formative years.
You never heard say again? You never heard what?
An anti-IP argument in my formative years.
So you assumed everyone was pro-IP?
Yeah, but I didn't even think much about it.
Right. Okay.
Now I do remember having a conversation with some of my fellow libertarians at Temple, because we had a Temple Libertarian Club, and we were kind of objectivists too. And of course, Rand defended IP.
Right.
I don't remember discussing IP, but I remember, and I brought it up. What do we think of libel? So we were getting close to it. We were getting close to it. And I think I decided, I guess you could justify libel, not because you can own a reputation, but it's income you would have had except for the libeler's action, something like that.
Right.
Now, the first time I started hearing anti-IP arguments were from Tom Palmer at the very time you're talking about, and Fred Smith, the late Fred Smith of this Competitive Enterprise Institute.
Really? Okay.
He was very vigorous in making his case, and it was the first time I was hearing this.
Wait, he was anti-IP, Fred Smith?
He was anti-IP.
See, Fred I don't think I have him on my radar. Has he ever written?
He died just recently, sad to say.
Did he write on this? Do you know? Did he talk
about it? He must have somewhere, but I don't know where.
Okay, I'm going to look into that.
Maybe it's CEI. This stuff might still be there.
And I recently wrote an article in the last year, and I argued that defamation should. So IP right now is it didn't used to be called IP. It used to be called privileges or trademark, trade secret, patent, and copyright. And then in the 1800s, the free market economists started attacking mostly patents as a privilege that should be abolished. And then in response, the defender started calling it a natural right or intellectual property right. So the classical IP rights are considered to be patent, copyright, trademark, and trade secret. They basically force-team themselves with trademark and trade secret, which are sort of common law things. to get to justify calling them one type of right. But defamation rights or defamation law protects what I would call a reputation right, and that's considered separate. But I argued last year in this article that you should consider it to be a type of IP right because it's very similar in its form and its effect and in its justification to trademark law. But I guess I'm curious. I assume you've changed your mind on defamation law and you're against defamation law now, like Walter Block and Rothbard were.
Yes, I mean, it was Rothbard really who convinced me about this.
Okay.
Although I must say, I now and then come revisit this subject because,
Right.
and this may be part of a different conversation, really, or principle. But and tell me what you think of this. I'd be glad to, be talked down or, just see what you say. I'm starting kind of at the end of the process. I don't like the idea, and I'm sure you don't, and Block doesn't, and Murray wouldn't. I don't like the idea that someone's life could be ruined by someone else systematically telling a malicious lie about a person. So that doesn't sit well with me.
No, I don't like it either. But on the other hand, IP people don't like the idea that you can put your effort into something and have someone quote steal it. But
yeah, but that's not quite the same.
It's not the same. No,
that
you're
seems
right.
mild to destroying somebody. You are spreading that someone is a child molester, pedophile.
Correct.
And man, forget it.
Correct. Yeah. Now
his life could be over.
And you're right.
Now, I'm not saying that's a defense. I'm not saying
no. It's something worth thinking about, and it is a separate topic. Real briefly, I'll tell you. So, and Jeff Dice, by the way, who's a friend of mine, Jeff Dice has argued that he's arguing maybe we shouldn't be so quick to condemn the cause of action for defamation, partly because it emerged more naturally and spontaneously in a decentralized legal system like the common law. So maybe we should give it some presumptive validity or something like that. I'm not quite so. Anyway, I don't think it's as well. I would say it's not as damaging as patent and copyright, but I kind of do think it's probably worse in its effects than trademark and trade secret law. So I would say if you rank the damage done by these types of IP rights, if you want to call it, would be patent first, copyright second, and then defamation or reputation rights would be third. Now, in a chapter in my book, the one that came out 2 years ago, Legal Foundations of a Free Society, chapter 8, it's about causation. I think in some cases you could make an argument that some actions you take that play a role in causing physical damage to someone can be actionable. Like that's why I disagree with Walter Block and Rothbard when they say that incitement is never you can never be liable for inciting a crowd to do something. I think you could be liable because the crowd is liable or the lynch mob is liable, but also you're liable. If you lie on the witness stand and to get someone you dislike to be criminally punished, yeah, you could blame the state's legal system. You could blame the jury. You could blame the judge. You could blame the jailer, but you can also blame the guy lying. So words can play a causal role in committing aggression, but I think you would have to limit defamation harm to something like that, but not anchored to a reputation right, because strictly speaking, people have the right to rely on whatever information they want, even if it's bad information, and they have the right to believe whatever they want about people. So so with that caveat, I would say it's worth exploring, and it could be treated differently. But let's return to basically patent and copyright. So you were initially pro-defamation law in a sense because you took it for granted, and then you also took for granted you took for granted the case for IP until you started hearing Tom Palmer and Fred Smith, you were saying.
Yeah, because I hadn't really thought about it, so it wasn't like they had to talk me out of it. It was just something you inherit, from the culture, and of course Rand had defended too. So I thought, I didn't even give Rand's article much thought about that because it was something I already thought was, true. And so it was a new thing for me when I started hearing Palmer, and I was having conversations with these guys. I wasn't just reading stuff. I was in DC working Council for Competitive Economy, Inquiry Magazine. So I was seeing these guys at receptions and social occasions. And Fred was particularly excited about it and was willing to talk to anybody who, was willing to listen to him. And it just was making sense that how do you How do you own
Okay.
a pattern of words? What does it mean to
So,
own a
right.
book? Well, I know what it means to own a,
Right,
the physical
right.
book. I can go buy a book. But
So you became anti-IP, and then I think probably Sam Conkin and Wendy started writing a little bit about it. But I think it still didn't get a lot of attention until not even Palmer, because this was '89. I think it started getting attention when the internet hit. So the internet became a thing around 90 and 95, and that's when people started paying attention, because they started noticing, oh wait, what's going on with people getting their website shut down for streaming music, and that's when people started looking at it.
Oh yeah.
But so you were already fairly solid on this, and I'm trying to remember, when did you start writing? Kind of.
I don't know when I wrote I must have written something in the Freeman. I didn't become editor of the Freeman until about 98, 97, 98.
Okay.
So I think I had an article just called, patently absurd or something like that.
Right, I remember that article. So that was sort of after I had written, and Roderick Long was starting to write, but you had already formed your views. But we all sort of, you and me and Jeff Tucker and these guys, we all sort of were kind of allies on this area. So that's awesome. Okay, now I'm gonna. So Andre, are you there? Andre,
Yes,
there you
I
go.
am. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, why don't you introduce yourself, and we'll chat a little bit.
Well, I'm a Brazilian libertarian. I'm a libertarian since my high school. It would be 2012. Like I knew a libertarian American sense. In Brazil, we have another meaning over libertarianism. What we call libertário would be just anarcho-capitalists that follow the ethics, like the property ethics, not utilitarists, not Randians and anything like that. It's just like today in the modern sense, like the contemporary discussion is devolving. Is like, should we adopt the American libertarianism, or as we have the term liberal for classic liberals, not leftists? Well, they are leftists in my opinion, but okay. Should we how should we organize? So just telling you this difference. I was born and raised on the frontier of Brazil and Argentina in Uruguay, so I developed my own practical theory as a what must be done but Brazilian edition, because here in Brazil, the political system is not federated like the United States. It's centralized, so you cannot repeal higher laws, like this. The county cannot repeal a state law or anything like that, and not allow for someone to enforce it, or in some ways, because I know in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, the sheriff can just like, oh, pot is outlawed in the state, but over here will not prosecute. So you can make a de facto legalization, if not de jure, right? And I am one of the main. I have a small YouTube channel, 20,000 subscribers, but I pack a lot of punch in this case because I brought the Hoppean ethics to Brazil, like made it more popular and discuss it, because back in the day people just talk about the NAP. It was the gold standard for libertarians, and all the discussions over here is, oh, does this agree to NAP or not? And I was like, we are discussing the wrong matter, because you are just talking about like a material point of view, not a rational, let's say, about justifications. And I developed my own strategies, like fronteirismo, fronteirismo, what I call. It's like it's like a digital nomad, but using nearby jurisdictions to have more advantages. For example, Argentina before Milei, it was really cheap to buy stuff like meat, wines and stuff, even cigars and tobacco. This one is imported from Denmark, for example. Here in Brazil is 90 Brazilian reais. It would be almost $18. In Argentina would be like 10, you know, so you have these advantages. I know some Americans do that, like going to Mexico to buy some stuff and then come back, but I start to defend that as let's say like a systematic way to prevent yourself to pay taxes in some places and stuff. It's just flag theory, but in a more analogic way, you know, like you can just do with your car and you're on 2 feet going around. And I was like in a low point, not doing many videos and stuff, but after a friend gave me a challenge, I start to record everything again and retake all my main points. For example, I don't believe private keys from Bitcoin are yours. They are just intellectual property. They are just a secret, for example. And there is a big discussion over here because many Bitcoiners in Brazil are saying Bitcoin is the only private property. Anything else is not. And I'm like, you are arguing with your body. You're doing something wrong.
Right.
And I'm trying to push a concept of fiduciary property, like property that is not natural. It's not. You cannot homestead. You can just take it by contract, by consensus. You know, like Bitcoin and deeds and titles and stuff, contracts. And now I'll start to discuss with some friends, a Catholic priest. I'm an agnostic, more like an atheist, you know, but I have friends in many religions here in Brazil, in Uruguaiana, the city I live. There is a Muslim community, many Catholics, and I have a lot of contact with traditional Catholics in Argentina. And I'm doing my new argument is like, oh, I think there is a limitation over contractual relations that you cannot do. You cannot, like, let's say, build unsolvable contracts. I don't know how to explain that in technical.
Yeah. Well, before you go on, let me interrupt for a second. I was talking earlier today with another guy named Brian Gladish about building IP on contracts. I might have gotten him. So you and I, we weren't talking about IP really, were we? We were talking more about the contract issue. But you are.
I have arguments over IP. I follow more your vision. I have just a small, let's say, input over defamation.
Right.
But that is not the topic we are talking about.
Right. And okay. So but Sheldon, so we'll turn to in a second to your contract theory. But Sheldon, where do you stand on the are you sort of like familiar with and a follower of Rothbard's title transfer theory of contract and that kind of stuff?
Yes, that's been my framework ever since he began publishing that. He and Bill Evers began publishing on that in the first issues of the Journal of Libertarian Studies. I remember when it was a yellow journal, it became blue later on. I was reading that stuff, and as a friend of mine used to say, this is pure oxygen. We just loved every issue of that. And that's where I learned and thought about contracts for the first time. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer. I never went to law school. Well, I have brothers. My brothers were lawyers and went to law school. My father offered to pay my way through law school until the day he died, and I just didn't want to go to law school. I said, sorry, I don't want to do that. So I don't know it in detail, but that always made total sense to me.
Well, I've always thought, since I read it, I think it's one of Rothbard's most brilliant and overlooked achievements. And he wasn't a lawyer either. Neither was Evers, who Williamson, Evers, and Rothbard together sort of pioneered this theory. And I think it's kind of a brilliant way to break out of the deadlock that lawyers and the legal positivists and the law has, the way it looks at contracts. And I think it helps to shore up and understand the IP case and also property rights in general. It's like you get back to basics. Like there's possibility of physical conflict in the world, which is what violence and aggression is about. That's why the non-aggression principle. That's what even Ayn Rand said. No one may start the use of force, but the word force is in there. Force is a physical thing. It's the way we use our physical bodies to manipulate physical things in the world to get things done. I mean, it's people say you're being physicalist or reductionist, but it's just that's an aspect of our lives that we can't avoid. That's what scarcity is all about. And Rothbard's view, now I think because he wasn't a lawyer and because he was pioneering a theory, there are some mistakes he made, which I've tried to build on recently and a few years ago too, to kind of clarify and extend and improve his contract theory, but it was basically his. I think actually if he had followed it consistently, he would have realized that his kind of contract argument for common law, what he called common law copyright, is confused and doesn't even, it's not consistent with his own contract theory. But and before we, so I know that there are some people, so once you view contracts as just the disposition of control rights over a resource that's owned by an owner by his manifestation of his consent, whether that consent is temporary or permanent, right? Then the whole concept of contracts being a promise that's binding, that gives rise to legally binding obligations, just disappears. It's got nothing to do with obligations. It's just the transfer of ownership or a claim to some resource, whether it's now or whether it's in the future. If it's in the future, there's some differences because the future thing doesn't exist yet. And so future contracts are always uncertain and they're always conditional, because the condition is that the thing that you're transferring has to exist, if nothing else. So that makes a difference. So when you have a loan contract, for example, this is where Rothbard went wrong. Rothbard said that in theory, if you don't repay a loan, you're violating the contract, which means you're stealing, you're engaged in what he called implicit theft, which I think is a nonsense concept. You're implicitly stealing something. And so theoretically, debtor's prison would be justified, although then he tried to save that by saying, but that would be disproportionate according to his punishment theory. So he sort of ran himself into a hole that he tried to dig out of. But I think you just don't need to say that failure to repay a loan in the future is theft, because theft is just the use of something without someone's permission. And you can't steal something that doesn't exist. So if you're bankrupt on the due date, there's nothing to steal. Now, that's sort of the implications of my sort of more consistent reworking of Rothbard's contract theory. Before we turn to Andre's scenario, do you have any comments on that, or do you think that makes rough sense, Sheldon?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, these are very fine points that I have not busied myself trying to learn. The implicit theft, the bankruptcy presents an interesting scenario, but let's say you're not bankrupt, you just don't want to give the money back. I wouldn't have had don't think I had a problem with the idea of it being theft, because
me neither. It's not, but it's not implicit. It's actual theft. It's not implicit.
Retaining possession.
Correct.
You were supposed to turn it over and you didn't do it.
Correct.
So
it would be fraud.
I wasn't bothered by calling that theft. No, the bankruptcy issue, it doesn't exist.
Well, I think it would not be fraud technically. What it would be is this. On day one, I transfer to you a future thing that I own on the condition that I own it and that it exists. And on that, so I've already set in motion the transfer of title to this future thing. And on that future due date, when that condition is satisfied, that is, the condition is the date has arrived and the thing exists and I own it, then the ownership automatically becomes that of the other guy. So now I'm in possession of it, and merely possessing someone else's thing is not theft, because presumably I'm holding it by permission of the new owner, because that was the arrangement. But if I refuse to turn it over, now I'm detaining something that someone else owns. So that is a type of theft or trespass.
Yeah, that's the way.
However you want to call it.
We call receptação, which means like when you possess something that you should not have it. It's like it's a crime here in Brazil.
Correct.
Like you were not the one who stole, but for example, you bought it. You bought from the guy who stole the property. So, and that is really annoying, because sometimes people sell stolen property at a discount. And
correct. And so I think now, if you possess something on the moment it transfers, I don't think you're committing anything wrong, because presumably you have the permission to hold it.
And to transfer, you need to possess it. So yeah, it's
well, what I'm saying is that the guy that owns the property that becomes transferred legally to the next guy he's holding it temporarily until it's demanded by the owner. But when it's demanded by the owner, if you don't hand it over, now you're detaining something someone else owns. The law has different ways of characterizing that, but I think the general libertarian concept is you're using someone's property without their permission, or you're detaining it, or you're committing trespass, or you're stealing it.
Yeah, it's an aggression in some way.
It's an
like
aggression. That's the main thing. It's and the essence of aggression is using someone's resource without their permission. That's it. Now, now I know that there are some Bitcoiners, for example, and you're right. I have argued that Bitcoin is not property. Actually, I don't say that. I say that you cannot own Bitcoin. It's not a type of thing that can be owned, just like ideas and information are not types of things that can be owned. But Bitcoiners take that as a criticism of Bitcoin. It's not a criticism. When I think what happens is people use colloquial language quite often. So when they say you own that Bitcoin, what they mean is you possess it, or you have the practical ability to keep it under your control and to transfer it when you want to. And because the purpose of legal ownership in a juristic sense is to support the right of possession or the ability to possess in the practical world, they conflate those terms. They conflate ownership with possession. And so in the Bitcoin world, there's only possession, but they call it the word ownership.
Yeah,
and
there
that's
is
fine.
no right
Yeah.
for control.
But there's no right. Go ahead,
Can I ask
Sheldon.
a question now?
Yeah.
Bitcoin, I know less about Bitcoin than I know about contract theory. Why can't, so this is just an open question to you, to both of you. Why can't you own Bitcoin? but
Well,
only
I would say
possess
I would say you can't own it because Bitcoin doesn't exist as a corporeal or a physical thing that can be owned. Just for the same reason you can't own information. Information is what guides your action, and a Bitcoin is just the way we conceive of an entry on a spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet is just an abstract mathematical structure which is stored in the memory cells of 10,000 computers around the world that participate in the blockchain. So the Bitcoin doesn't really exist as a thing. It's just the way that the memories of different people's computers are arranged, and we interpret it as humans as signifying entries or in a ledger or a spreadsheet. So it's for the same reason that you can't own a recipe, because to own the recipe, it's just information that doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always stored on an underlying physical medium. Like if I own a book, I don't own the way it's arranged. I own the book itself, the physical book. The information, the pattern of a novel has to be stored somewhere. And whatever it's stored on is owned by some owner. That's why you can't own information, because if you own the information, it would have to give you a property right in the physical things on which the information is stored, which is where you get copyright or IP from. So it's that kind of argument which I've made.
So what are you buying when you pay for Bitcoin? What do people think they're, well, not what they think. What are they actually buying?
And this gets to another thing I wrote about in chapter, I think 11 or 13 of my book, about we have to distinguish between the concepts, between economic and normative concepts when we use words like sell. So the way I think of it is this: in contracts, if you think of it in Rothbard's terms, if a contract is just the transfer of title to an owned resource, okay, that's got to be done by some communication manifesting your consent, but it could just be a one-way title transfer, a gift, for example, or it could be done for some reason. But the point is, you're always doing something in human action for some reason, right? You're doing something to achieve some end. And in a typical simple exchange where two people own things like an apple and an orange, and I consent to give you my orange and you consent to give me your apple in exchange for each other doing that, where we both want possession of the other person's piece of fruit, but we also want ownership of it. So in that case, the end of these actions is to get ownership and possession of the other person's thing. But in other contracts, we use the word sell, but so in that case that we would use economically, we would say you sell it, and legally you sell it too. Like, so they coincide. But if I just perform an action for you that you want me to perform, like painting your fence, or what we call sale of labor, or an employment contract, or something, or a service contract, we use the economic terms sell and buy because that describes what people are doing. But then we tend to think, well, that must mean if you're selling something in an economic sense, you must be owning it too in a legal sense. But that's actually that's the mistake I think people make. So if I agree to move my body in a way, like to perform a dance for you, and you agree to pay me for it, there's only one title transfer in a legal sense. You're agreeing to pay me money that you own, which you presumably have physical title of, in conditioned upon me doing something, performing an action. But it doesn't mean you bought the action in a legal sense. You could, in economic terms, you can describe it that way. This is why it gets confusing, because we use the same terms. Okay, so in case of Bitcoin, if I buy a Bitcoin, let's say I perform a service for you. To make it simple, I'm working for you, and I say I'm going to perform 3 hours of work for you, and if I do that, you have to agree to transfer to me a Bitcoin. What that means is you have to transfer a Bitcoin to me as an action, and if you don't do that, then we presumably have subsidiary or auxiliary contracts that say something like, and if you don't, then you owe me damages, which would be you have to pay me, $3,000 worth of your property or your resources. So there's always a backup enforcement mechanism. But basically, in that case, you could say it's just two actions, like I'm acting to paint your fence or to do whatever you want me to do, and you're acting to take motions that give me physical control of your Bitcoin. That's how I would look at it. But it's physical.
But it's physical control. It's physical control. But you're saying it's not ownership. I'm having a
correct. It's not ownership, and the reason
here.
it's not ownership is for the so if you were to have ownership of a book you wrote, the reason that that's a problem is it gives you a property right interest in other people's printing presses. You can stop them from printing a book, right? That's the problem with IP. If it was totally intangible, if it's like you say you have an IP right and it's not enforceable except in non-physical force, then we wouldn't care. The only reason we care is if it actually affects other people's property. And in the case of Bitcoin, if you say you own a Bitcoin, but the Bitcoin is just an abstract conceptualized entry on a distributed ledger, and that ledger is stored on 10,000 people's computers, then so let's say someone steals my Bitcoin, okay? Like they go into my house and they commit a crime, they commit trespass, and they break into my computer and they transfer my Bitcoin to their own account. Now, I think you could prosecute them for the trespass they committed. They breached a contract or they used my property without my permission. But if you say they also stole your Bitcoin that you own, then theoretically you would have a right to get an injunction from a court to apply to every Bitcoin node operator in the world who has their own computer and give them an order to reverse the blockchain to give you your Bitcoin back. And you don't have that right because they own their own computers. And just like defamation is not a right, people have the right to think what they want. People have the right to arrange the blockchain pattern on their own computer however they see fit. So it just makes no sense to say you have a property right in a Bitcoin, because it would
sounds
give
like
you
an argument against Bitcoin.
No, it's an argument. It's an argument against ownership of Bitcoin, but it doesn't. But the reason it doesn't matter is because it's the whole reason for ownership is to give you an additional normative or legal security for actual physical possession that you need to do in the real world. It gives you extra security against the possibility that people can take your house from you or your cow from you. But in the case of Bitcoin, you don't actually even need that because it's like almost impossible for them to take it from you. So the physical control of Bitcoin is better than super property rights and other things, because you don't even need a lock. You just need to not tell people your password or your security keys, and then they can't take it. And so you can analogize it to ownership, but it's not really ownership. Just like if you go stand in line in New York for a play, people say, I have a spot in line, but that's just an analogy. It's a contractual thing by the owner of the establishment of the sidewalk that lets you organize your affairs that looks like a property right, but it's not really a property right.
Yeah, right. I think most people would agree with you.
So go ahead. So that's the background. So now let's get to your question about interest.
Just over this topic.
All right, go ahead.
I made an article. It is in Portuguese, but I think you can give to ChatGPT and it can translate properly. About the idea of fiduciary property, which is the property or the ownership, let's say, on quotes, over a consensus, something that is derived from a consensus or a contractual structure, because Bitcoin is not like a physical thing. It's just a share over a balance allocated into a wallet.
Okay.
And you cannot own it. It's not a physical resource that you can appropriate. It does not exist outside a wallet or and stuff. So it's not like gold in this way.
Correct.
The other thing is the consensus, the code, and all the nodes and miners, they come together and they have rules how to transact and how to create Bitcoins in this case. Because you have the block being doing it. So the main idea is you are not the owner in a private property sense, but you are the fiduciary owner, like who holds the key, who holds the secret, holds the control. And there is my main point is like, there is no real argument over I'm the owner of the Bitcoin against the blockchain, because the secret owner, the private key owner, the seed as we call, is the de facto control, and the de jure control is that external conception over the Bitcoin, let's say the environment, like it's not something built in on Bitcoin. It's external conception that we transpose over Bitcoin.
Are you imagining a scenario where sort of a norm would emerge among all the participants in the Bitcoin network, where if there was some kind of blatant act of theft, they might agree to, I don't know.
They already made that. They have tainted Bitcoins on which, like, some nodes, they have a second consensus on which they say these Bitcoins are tainted and you should not accept these transactions.
Right.
And they just like, so if you get this receipt, they taint your address and your wallet. But this is just like a social limitation, not technical. It's like,
and I totally agree with that, by the way. I think that it's sort of like, I have no problem with that, as long as you distinguish it as you did. If you add an adjective like fiduciary ownership or something, which is just like when people say ownership, and I say, well,
it's like a deed or a title.
It's like it, but it's not the same thing, right? So
not the same thing, because the title and the deeds, they are emitted by a central figure most of the time.
Yeah, just like your place in line is not really a property right, but it acts like one, and it's good enough.
And someone can steal your place in line, and
and we can
violating
use these terms,
the rules. You can just
language is malleable, and we have analogies and metaphors, and words have different meanings, as long as you keep in mind the fact that we're using a metaphor in this case, and that's all.
I just did this argument because a lot of people are saying it's the only property, and I say no, you cannot argue that. If it's arguing it, you are recognize the body, so you recognize at least two.
Correct. Yeah, it's certainly less primary and more fundamental, less fundamental. It's based upon an implicit recognition of the fundamental nature of property rights in scarce resources acquired in accordance with homesteading or occupation and contract.
Any other property does not need social social agreement. Like let's say if I took wood and make this pipe, I'm the owner of the pipe. It does not matter what people think about it. Like, you should not have it and stuff. So it's less a social construct, let's say in this way, even sounding like a woke guy, but no, I'm not. It's a lot less social construct, but Bitcoin is purely a social construct. It's derived from a social interaction, not like
totally agree. And
isn't it the case that with physical property, it's still
physical property? I am the owner.
Right against all other people. It's not a right so much in the thing.
Correct.
It's erga omnes. My physical property is erga omnes against everyone. The Bitcoin needs to be recognized by the consensus to be mine.
But I think Sheldon's Sheldon is making a different point. I think your point, Sheldon, correct me if I'm wrong, is that not only are real property rights erga omnes, or good against the world without agreement, right? They're just good against everyone, but also it's not really a right to the property. It's a right against other people with respect to the property. Is that what you're getting at, Sheldon?
That is what I'm getting at, except isn't it also the case that in older use of the word property, like, I mean, I'm talking about now the 18th century or so, they would say you had a property right in a thing.
Correct.
They wouldn't say that's your property. They would say you have a property right
Exactly.
in the
Yes,
thing.
and I think I hinted at that earlier when I was talking about state versus government. In the careful legal writers, there's one I cite in my writing named Yiannopoulos, who is a well-known civil law scholar in Louisiana. Yeah, he makes the point that, listen, and he wrote a treatise called Property. And in his treatise, he points out that, yeah, if you want to be technically precise and careful, the word property should not refer to the thing that you own. It means there's a property right in that thing. So I am the owner of a thing, or I have a property right in the thing, like a car. But what people do is they become careless and they'll say, well, that car is my property. But what they really mean is I have a property right in that thing. And the reason that it's not nitpicking to point this out is because if you make the mistake of saying the car is my property, well, then when we have a debate about intellectual property, then the question is, hey, Kinsella disagrees with me, and he says that ideas can't be property. And that's not, the argument is not that ideas can't be property. The idea is that all property rights are control rights, or they're exclusion rights, but they're control rights to the control of a physical resource over which there could be conflict, right? And so that thing is a scarce resource, and that is the resource that you have a property right in. And we have certain conception of what rules justify how we determine who the owner is. And those rules are basically self-ownership in the case of your body, and in the case of other things that used to be unowned that became possessed and used at one point, is simply occupation, or homesteading, people call it, and contractual title transfer. That's basically it. And one other, which is a side point, rectification. But so once you understand that, then when my argument is not that ideas or information can't be property, it's that ideas are just the way a resource is configured, and someone already owns that in accordance with the first two rules. And if you say there's a property right in the way it's arranged, now you have what Roderick Long calls a universal. You have ownership of a universal. Like it'd be like if I owned a red car and I claimed that means I own redness. Well, now that means everyone else's red thing, I own that too. So it's a way of violating the very strict rules of property assignment, which is original occupation and contractual title transfer. So we don't say that ideas can't be property. We say that information is not the type of thing in which you can have a property right, because information doesn't exist on its own. It's just the way that an existing thing that can be owned is shaped or configured or arranged. And Ayn Rand and Rothbard Mises all kind of say this. They say, and even Ayn Rand said that we never create anything ab initio. We only rearrange the way things are. And she should have realized what that meant was that you own the thing, but you don't own the way that it's arranged. Because if you own the thing and the way it's arranged, you're double counting, and that would give you the right to control other people's things that are similarly arranged. That's the fundamental mistake.
One of your most powerful arguments, and I was already on the anti-IP side, but when I heard you say this some years ago, I was super impressed with it. That if you own wood, you own all the materials that are going to make a house, and then you make the house. So Rand wants to say, and Rothbard I guess Rothbard would say, well, no, he was against patents, wasn't he?
He was, but he did nod to the Lockean idea that you can own something by homesteading it, or by creating it. It's like, well, but you can't really create something. You have to own it to create a product.
So let's take the Rand. If you design a house, if you're Howard Rourke and you bought the wood, you bought the materials. All honestly, you now own it because you can own materials, right? So you bought the materials. Now you have this brilliant idea, and you construct a house. Too. So you make the house, and so Rand wants to say, she wants to make the key thing that brilliant design you had in your head at first, and then put on paper, and then built. But it's like Occam's razor. Maybe this is Kinsella's razor. You already owned it.
Yes.
The idea add anything to the ownership. Which is not to say it's not important. Of course.
No, that's what they confuse.
Why do you need to say, yeah, but he came up with the design?
Because the Randians, they focus on the importance of being able to create value, which is, they're correct about that. But to have that right, you just have to have the right to have secure property rights in physical resources, and then you can do what you want with it. I mean, in a way, this is why I argue that the mistake Locke made, which I think I know why he made the mistake. He was trying to overcome Filmer's argument, stuff like that. But he added this unnecessary step that you own your labor and therefore you own what you mix it with. But that labor theory of property, I think, probably in a way led to the labor theory of value, right, of Smith and Marx. And this is why, in a way, this IP argument is Marxian, because, you know, when the left criticizes employment and capitalism for stealing the surplus labor value of employees, it's because they're imagining that by their effort, they're creating the cars that they make. Okay. But they lose sight of the fact that, okay, the owner of the car that's produced on the assembly line depends upon who owns the raw materials that went into it. Right. So, you know, if I steal some marble from my neighbor's property and I carve a statue into it, I did create the statue, but I don't own that piece of marble.
Yeah, but because the surplus value, this will be a segue into what you wanted to talk about. The so-called surplus value, which is denied the worker and collected by the capitalist, is interest.
Correct. Now,
it's other things too. There may be wages in there, and there may be pure entrepreneurial profit in there too, Kersnerian, Misesian profit. But probably the larger part of it is interest, because time has passed and the workers were paid present dollars at the present, and the capitalist agreed to do the waiting.
Correct.
And get future dollars in the future if they materialize, if he can sell the product. That's a risk.
Correct. But the problem with this interest,
you cannot own time.
You can't own time. I agree. You can't own time. I don't think time even. Well, that's a whole different.
No, it's not a physical thing. It's like you cannot own labor.
Well, I'm saying.
No,
but saying you own your own labor. I don't have a problem with that. I don't see where that leads.
No,
well, because
it's a colloquial position in this case. It's just like analogy, but you cannot own labor because labor is not storable. You cannot have it. It's not tangible. Like when you do, labor is an economic good, but it's not property, because when you do a labor, for example, if I write you a letter, let's say, when I finish writing, my labor was already consumed. So I cannot store it. Oh, I can store the fruits of my labor, but not the labor itself. That would be the main point. Like,
Sheldon, I think
maybe resting up is storing your labor.
I think, Sheldon, I think one way to think of it is, you know, economically, we distinguish two types of action. There's, just like we say, there's two types of goods. There's consumption goods, things consumed for their own sake or made for their own sake, and production goods, right? Intermediate goods that right, capital goods. And so by the same token, we distinguish two types of action. One is labor and one's leisure, right? Leisure is what you do for its own pleasure and sake, and labor is what you do to obtain something else. So it's like an intermediate thing, like capital is. And if you divide action into two types, like there's two types of action, there's labor and there's leisure. I don't know if there's a third, but logically speaking, I can only think of those two, labor and non-labor. Now, it would seem unnatural and absurd to say that you own your leisure, right? Or even better, to say you own your action, because action is just what you do with the things that you have control of, your body and other resources that you can control. So just like it wouldn't make any sense to say you own your action, because your action is what you do over time using resources you have control of. It wouldn't make sense to say you own your leisure or you own your labor. Those are just types of things you do.
Yeah, I see your point. But as you said earlier, language is metaphorical.
Correct.
Even poetic.
Correct.
A slave owner would claim that he owns the labor of the slave.
Correct. And like if you are enslaved or you're murdered, you could say or if you're taxed, let's say, you could say that the effect of the government taxing me is to steal my labor. Now, that's a colorful metaphorical way of saying it. Technically speaking, what the state is doing is the state is coercing you with a threat of physical force against your body or things you own to make you do what they want you to do on pain of administering force to you. But the effect of that is to get you to give them some of your money, which they claim ownership of, right? So, and you could say, well, they're stealing my labor because the time I spent acquiring these resources, I could have, I used it for the benefit of the state. So it is true you can put things that way, but you have to keep in mind that it's only a metaphor.
Yeah, and the abolitionists called the slavers man stealers.
Exactly. That's my point. And so you could measure the damage done or the restitution owed by various criteria. And you can think of it in that term. But theoretically speaking, it's like saying you have a right to life. I mean, the right to life is just sort of a general principle by which we condemn acts of aggression because it interferes with your ability to live your life in the way you want to live it. Again, the problem is saying you own your labor is that if you take it literally, then you start thinking of it as like a substance that's owned, and when you sell it for money, then you're selling something you own. And if you own it, then you own things you mix it with, and then you get to the Marxian labor theory of value. And you get to what I call libertarian creationism and IP, because if you labor on something to create something valuable or useful, then you should have. So they start thinking that creation is a source of property rights.
I'm not sure I buy that. The fact that people make a misstep with it doesn't mean there's a problem with the original concept. I mean, you just said the worker, who owns the materials? So how can the worker claim to own the finished product when he didn't own any of the materials? He just under contract exerted effort regarding the material. So that seems to be the answer. I don't.
Yeah, I agree. I just think, and I'm not really criticizing it so much as saying the way it was presented and the way it's understood is the explanation of why people get confused about intellectual property.
The danger you were saying, there's a
no,
danger.
it's really dangerous because here in Brazil, as many libertarians are not fluent in English. My English is not very good too, but these get really mixed up. Even in translations, they mix up all the time. So mainly what I do is just like, no, you can say that in a metaphorical way, and people just say, oh, you are just annoying, like, or you just want to annoy people. And no, I want to get things straight. Like, you should not say you are the owner of your labor. Like, you can say that, the state is stealing my labor because I need to work for him. Okay. But it's not like you're the owner. That's the point. Like, it's common for people to get it wrong. And even if you start to translate, it's worse because then you start to pile up layers of mistakes in this case.
Yeah. And related to this, I mean, who owns what and how relevant is ownership of the materials? One of the thoughts you've inspired in me some years ago, Stephan, and I think I wrote this somewhere, is if Howard Rourke's evil twin sneaked onto your property where you had wood, glass, all the makings of a house, right? And he's as brilliant as Howard Rourke is, and he builds this totally unique, never done before in that design with your stuff.
Yeah.
He builds this magnificent thing.
Yeah.
Does he own it? Well, of course, the answer is no, and you have a right to bomb it like the other Howard Rourke does in the novel. I mean, you can blow it up and hurt other people.
Which is another way of showing that creation is not a source of ownership. Creation. Here's the thing: creation is a source of wealth, but wealth is just a subjective phenomenon. Is the way we value the utility of an arrangement of a given resource. And by the way, that's one reason I'm still not quite sure why The Fountainhead was the book that inspired me to become libertarian, because now I think of it as like, I mean, Atlas Shrugged is great, but The Fountainhead is a book of IP terrorism mixed in with narcissism and sexual domination kinks and quasi rape. I mean, The Fountainhead is like the weirdest novel. I don't know, but it's a story about an IP terrorist.
Right. No, the building is blown up. He makes sure no one gets hurt, but it's
But,
built.
by the way, interestingly, the law, the positive law, and I'm not sure whether I agree with this or not. It's neither here nor there. But the positive law actually has a way of dealing with the situation you mentioned, at least if it's an accident. So, for example, a simple example. Let's suppose I'm hired to paint a guy's house, but I go to the house next door instead on accident, and I paint that house. And let's say I don't botch the house. The house needed a paint job. And let's say the new owner of the home, the owner of the other house, sees me doing it and doesn't stop me. He goes, "Oh shit, I'm going to get a free paint job from this guy." So the law would form what's called a quasi contract, or they would have something called unjust enrichment. And the idea is that if you made a mistake and you unjustly enriched someone, it would be unjust to not compensate me somewhat, especially if the other guy's getting a benefit. And by the same token, with a more direct example, if I were to go into, let's say you have let's say you have a boulder in your front yard, just a natural boulder in your front yard, and I'm your neighbor, and I go into your front yard at night, and I spend all night carving a majestic statue in your boulder. Now, I have created a statue. It might even be worth a lot. So then the question is, well, I've created the statue. Do I have a partial claim for unjust enrichment or restitution from you, because I've given you something worth a lot of money, even though I basically trespassed against you? And those details, the law can work out, how intentional it was, whether it's mistaken. In cases where you can't undo it, but you can see that it would be an exceptional case, and you can see that what this means is that creation is simply not a source.
But let me get back. Let me get back to how it worked for a second. I want to.
Okay.
So I have some second thoughts about this, which I had previously, but I forgot that I had them.
Mhm.
Why can't work say, I'm not claiming IP? I'm not saying I own the design. I'm saying I agreed to come up with a design under the condition that it will be built as I designed it. And that's what
Right.
Keating did. Now, maybe Keating didn't have authority to do that.
Correct.
Maybe he did. So in other words, he wasn't really making it. It wasn't an IP argument, was it? It was a fraud.
Yeah, but the problem, and of course, it's a novel, it's fictional, and Rand doesn't get into a lot of legal details or assumptions, but it basically rests upon the same assumption Rothbard made when he argued that you could have. The problem is it's question begging. It presupposes, it's a hidden presupposition of ownership of intangible things. Because when Rothbard argued that, okay, I don't believe in patents, or copyrights, but if I own a mousetrap and I sell it to you on the condition that you don't copy it, then I'm only giving to you the physical mousetrap, not the right to copy it. And so then the question is, okay, another way of saying that is you and I have a contract that is, in a way, we're co-owners of the mousetrap. Or you could even say there's two contracts here. I'm selling you my mousetrap design, but you agree not to copy it and sell a copy of it. And if you do, you've got to pay me some sum of money to compensate me for breach of contract. That's the way to look at it. So there's two title transfers. One is the transfer of the mousetrap, and the other is a future conditional transfer of money from the buyer back to Rothbard, that if you copy it, right? So that condition would trigger the payment of money. So there's just two title transfers. But then the question is, what about third parties like Brown? I think that's the example Rothbard used. And the problem is ensnaring third parties in what's a private contract regime, which is what you need to do to make IP rights real rights, or omnibus, good against the world. And Rothbard says, well, you can only sell what you own. And if I buy a mousetrap and it's missing the right to copy, and I give it to someone else, they don't also have the right to copy. So then they're bound by this contract. It's such a bad argument because, number one, the third party, Brown, doesn't have to buy the mousetrap to make a copy of it. He might just see it. So there's no way you could say he was a signatory to any contract then. It's just the whole idea that you can own a physical object that's missing the right to use it is almost nonsense, because that doesn't get you where you want to go. It doesn't get you to a limitation on other people's right to use the same information to modify their own property to make similar mousetraps.
So you think this is analogous to the case I'm going to give? I mean, it sounds close to it, but I'm still going to resist it. Let's say I'm this world-renowned architect.
Yeah.
And you come to me and you want me to design your home, And I say, I'll do it on the condition that you
Yeah.
as designed. If you don't like it, you don't like it. But if
Right.
you accept it, we're going to build it as designed. And then unbeknownst to me, you put Grecian columns.
Right. Now, I would say if it was
claim against you.
Yeah. So you're right. I got off track of it. So the case, and you could try to justify what Rourke did based upon this kind of contract thing by saying Rourke agreed to do it with Keating only on the condition that that I guess Keating makes sure that only a certain building be made based on or something like that. But the real problem in the way that law has to work, and it has to work in the real world, and it does work in the real world, is that as a practical matter, first of all, Rourke's involvement was secret, and it was meant to be secret, and Rourke knew that it had to be secret. And he had to know that Keating had no authority. Keating did not, by his contract, get any property title in the buildings that his client was going to make. So there's simply, now, if Rourke had insisted, Rourke would have had to insist, okay, I'm only going to do this if you, under penalty of a damage payment, you have to pay me if you don't do this. You have to make sure in your agreement with the client, you have to put a clause in there saying, if you adulterate my design, then you basically transfer partial ownership of your building to me and give me a negative easement over it that allows me to prevent you from building what I don't want built with it. If you'd done all that, then yes, Rourke's actions would have been theoretically justified. It's just I don't think that the scenario Rand's imagining could encompass that, because Rourke's involvement was secret, and I don't think Peter's contract with the client gave him any rights like that. That's the problem with that.
Well, and it was a really bad misjudgment on Rourke's part for those reasons. Plus, Keating was such a wimp. Why would he ever think Keating was going to stand up to?
Exactly. What's the expression?
It wasn't even private, right? It was a government authority. So why would you have any confidence in Keating?
Well, that's the only thing you could justify what Rourke did. I think it was a government housing project. So you could say that Rourke dynamited something that's status property, but then of course Rourke and Rand are not anarchists; they're minarchists. They believe the government's legitimate, so you couldn't even make that argument. But yeah. Anyway,
which makes the bombing all the more ironic, right? That a non-anarchist was blowing up this building.
Yeah, in fact, but you could say he was aiding and abetting this enterprise by going along with it. And again, in the law, we have these rules of thumb like caveat emptor, like buyer beware. I mean, Rourke was well aware of Peter Keating's snivelous nature, and aware that he was dealing with a government, and he was also aware that his design probably would be adulterated. That was his concern. He knew this was going to happen. I mean, this wasn't a surprise to anyone.
Okay, so it was a novel.
Yeah, it was. Maybe I'm being too hard on it.
To some extent.
So all this is about an hour of background just to get to, I think, the question of interest, which I think, Andre had. So, what were you asking me in the Twitter message thread we had about?
My problem is not against interest itself, but I think there is a problem over how I told you, because I remember what I say in Portuguese but not in English most of the times. It's like I think it would be not binding to have continuous, not like a promise of back pay, but a continuous charging interest, which has no limitation in a guarantee. And this guarantee should not be monetary, because money has the use of being spent. So you cannot have a guarantee over money, labor, and stuff like that. And I think, like, if you take if you stress the point, let's say, you would get into the idea which you can become a debt slave, indentured servant.
Right. Okay, so let me interrupt you for a second. I'll let you continue. This gets about, I think Sheldon and I were touching on this maybe before you joined, about bankruptcy. There is an issue in libertarianism, I believe, because if you believe, as I do, and I think most libertarians do, that rights are inalienable to your body, you can't sell yourself into a slavery contract.
Yeah, I agree. Your argument about limited alienability,
inalienability, yeah.
Yeah, that's I agree with that. I have the same position. Like, no, it's not the strong, not the weak, is the limited one.
And
Makes more
Sheldon,
sense for me.
Sheldon, I agree. I assume you're not in favor of the enforceability of voluntary slavery contracts, like about
1978 or so, or 9, I had an article in Murray's Libertarian Forum making that very point drawing on Spooner, because Spooner makes an argument against it.
what did you argue?
I argued that they're not valid contracts.
Right, and the thing is, I think I can count on my right hand. I think Walter Block,
Yeah.
Nozick hinted at it, and Gerard Casey. Those three are the only three libertarians I know that really want to say that you have the right to. And Walter is surprising because Walter claims to agree with Rothbard's title transfer theory of contract. So if you really believe that slavery contracts are enforceable, number one, that goes against Rothbard's own explicit denunciation of that in his own title transfer theory, but it also would transform every contract into a binding promise, which is what Rothbard's whole theory is against. They're saying that you don't view contracts as binding promises that are enforceable, that give rise to binding obligations. They're just transfers of title to the things you own. Now, Andre, that's what I'm not going to nitpick on your English. We're lucky you're speaking our language instead of the other way around. But when you say a binding I think what you mean is enforceable. What you're saying is you have an agreement to be paid interest in perpetuity or something like that. We can get into a specific, I think we should get into a specific example, but you're saying that that should be unenforceable, not that it's binding, but unenforceable. And there are some arguments you could make based upon inalienability, based upon this kind of concept of bankruptcy where, listen, if you take an obligation to transfer future things that you own to someone forever to the limit, you could effectively kill them or enslave them because they could never even eat. Because you could say every time someone gives you a piece of food, if you're bankrupt, to just keep you alive, then you could take that food from them too, because they don't even own that. You know, you could, and you could imagine a libertarian system that says, listen, you're basically killing this guy by not letting him even get a donation of food. So there could be arguments for some limitations on the enforceability of future conditional title transfers if it would effectively result in the enslavement of someone. I don't know the answer to that. I think you could imagine an argument, but short of that, I think that any contractual title transfer would be normally recognized to be enforceable. And it doesn't matter whether or not the thing exists anymore. Like in patent law, for example, there's an interesting anomaly where, so let's say I have a patent that lasts for 10 years, 10 more years. And I threaten to sue you unless you pay me a royalty for making widgets that are too similar to the patented claim of that patent. And so you pay me a royalty. Well, what the law says is that we can have a fair market, a free market, a fair market value of a royalty payment, but it can only last for the duration of the patent. And if you go beyond that, it's called abuse of patents. And that's because in the law, there's a conflict or a tension, they call it, between antitrust law and between patents, which grant monopolies in antitrust law, which is supposed to stop them. So they say you can't abuse your patent rights. You can only have it last until the patent expires. But you can make an agreement now that would cover the next 10 years of the patent. But if the patent got invalidated in 5 years in a court action, it was still, the original agreement is still valid for 10 years because it was in good faith and all this kind of stuff. But the point is, you could only bundle into it so much for the 10-year present market value of that royalty period. And so by the same token, what you could say is that if I loan you some money, why don't we take a real example? Give me one example, a clear example of a loan where you think the interest payments would be a problem, Andre.
Student loans on the United States, they are indispensable. If you go bankrupt, they keep charging you.
Wait, say again? I didn't hear you.
The student loans on the United States, some student loans have this characteristic. They have no limits. They keep charging interest. They have no, you cannot annul them by getting bankrupt. So they are like for life. They are worse than a curse, you know.
Okay, but couldn't you find other problems with those? Because in that case, the state's involved and and there's lots of other objections you can make to a
Yeah,
contract between.
my point about usury, I call usury, but I redefine it to fit into libertarian theory without going against interest. Like not interest for me is a valid thing, but the problem is when you need to have constraints on it.
Okay, hold on, but can we come up with an example that's not like, let's imagine an anarchist society with a free market and private property rules that are respected and contracts that are respected according to Rothbard and all this stuff. There's no state. Give me an example of a contract in that context that you have a problem with or a possible problem.
The problem is that I don't recognize this as a right, like enforceable, binding, all this kind of binding. Okay, as you said, it's just like how I use the words.
Yeah.
It's a bit crammy, but okay. But why I use this example is like I think this kind of usury that I'm pointing to is what constitutes the modern state, the fractional reserve, and the modern banking system is all like the heads of the same hydra, which is everything is constituted around it, around this. What is in my view a violation? So this would be like the best way to show it in some way, because now you have all the institutional structures around this kind of contract of this corruption that I think.
Well, look, if you want to argue,
I can do another example, like, but I'm just saying, like, this one is, I think, is the best one to show the real world problem.
Well, before we get into that, let me say something for Sheldon and for the listeners' benefit. There are some Bitcoiners like Seyfedin Ammous, and I don't know if this is related to your point or not. I thought it was when you mentioned this. They're trying to find a way to justify this sort of Muslim and maybe Jewish, this idea that there's something wrong with interest. And he's trying to say, well, in a Bitcoin world, you wouldn't really have interest because you'd have, you wouldn't have even loans, really. You'd have just people investing in companies and like there's all these workarounds, shenanigans, which, by the way, I think the Muslims and Jews do that. They have exceptions to their bans on interest. They call it something else. Instead of interest, they call it something else, or it's okay to have interest if it's with a Gentile, or I mean, there's all these things, but I think that's the origin of this sort of dispute, or at least in my mind. And I just think it's pointless because I think, and by the way, if you wanted to argue against the current system mired in the student loan process or the government involvement, or if you want to argue that this eternal payment that you're saddled with violates your rights because it violates inalienability because you need to have some kind of bankruptcy right, I think that's an argument you can have, but I just think it's different than an argument showing there's a defect in the title transfer theory of contract.
No, it's not against title transfer. It's not. It is just saying like it's not something that you can make a title over, because you cannot make a title over your own body, like in a way you cannot enslave yourself.
Okay. So it is an inalienability argument. You're saying that effectively this,
by not having a guaranteed limit, like for example, I give my house as a collateral for you. I take your money, give my house for you, but I keep using my house. Then interest, no problem. But after the interest like snowball a lot, you just take my house. But and it cuts the loan, like I do not owe you anything else. But the problem is if you don't have a limit, then you can, for example, if there is a market crash, you can just take my house and then charge me the difference between the set price and stuff.
Well, you can see why I brought up the patent example then, because the patent example, they also try to put a limit on how much you can extract in a future title transfer based upon the present economic value of a limited monopoly in time. So you see, it's a similar type of structure.
But I'm not saying that it should be like I am the dictator of limits, but saying like should there be a consideration of a limit? Like
well, and that's why I think that this ultimately devolves into the argument about inalienability and bankruptcy issues, which is I think an unexplored issue in libertarianism, and I've only hinted at it. I'm not sure what the right answer is, but if you take in general, this is why I think I told you in the paper I pointed you to, my title transfer paper, my most recent one. I tried to point out that
this one.
It helps to clarify. If instead of saying like, okay, there's a loan for money, I give you money present in the present right now, which is certain money now, non-conditionally transfer to you for you to spend, and in exchange you give me a future sum of money. Now we usually describe that sum as a repayment of the loan, and it's the original principal plus interest. But when you think of it that way, that's why it's easier to make the mistake Rothbard and Block do, that you're stealing something when you don't repay the loan. You're not really repaying a loan. They're two separate title transfers. There's a current title transfer to present money, which is consumed and gone by the borrower. And then there's a future title transfer. But if you make it different things, it makes it clear. Like if you don't make it a sum of money that is just varies by a rate of interest. If you say, I have a hammer, I'm going to give you this hammer now, and in exchange, you give me a future wrench. So they're two physical objects. One exists now that I own, and one is a future possible wrench that you might own, which you have to transfer to me in the future. In that case, there should be full contractual freedom to have that agreement enforced, which means, and by enforced, it just means the legal system recognizes the ownership of the wrench in the future transfers to the original lender of the hammer, right? That's all it means.
Yeah, that is not a problem. In what I'm pointing to is the problem, like, oh, but for time elapsed, now you get to owe me more wrenches. You know, that is a problem. Like, what is the limit?
Yeah, okay. But would you? So let's say
you can have like a contractual compensation for people like taking more time than what is allowed in the contract. But sometimes these contracts, they are open-ended. Like you don't have a end. You just have like, oh, if you pay until this time, there will be more or less this. But
Sheldon, did you have a point you were going to make? Sorry.
No, I'm watching this with great interest.
Okay, so I think that you could, first of all, you could criticize some contracts by being sufficiently vague that there's no clear consent. There's no clear consent as to what was agreed to. That's certainly a way that you could, contracts have to be definite, because all contracts are what trespass is it's the use of someone's resource without their consent. Now that's a general formulation, but it means that the owner has the right to say yes or no ultimately. And that has to be done by language or by some kind of communication, right? That could be informed by custom and could be informed by default rules of understanding. But ultimately, it's a communication. And the question of whether the communication was sufficiently clear as to alert the community as to who owns what is up to the parties. And in the case if it's too murky, it's got to go to an arbitrator, and it might just be you might have to throw your hands up and guess. But that's the fault of the parties for entering into an agreement or an interaction where the signs are not clear enough to everyone. And so, of course, if the wrong party loses, then that's going to give people an incentive, lawyers an incentive to draft the contracts with more particular terms, to use a standard form. And so over time, these things will become more and more minimized. So I think, but
partially I agree. The problem is the system that we have today is made in some way that like here in Brazil, for example, just to give an example, it's against the law usury. Like I cannot lend you money, charge interest. Okay. Or if I do it, should not be over 3%, 1 or 2% monthly. And it should not be compounding, if I'm not mistaken. But any bank or any financial institution can do it for like 300% a year. For example, a credit card. And I say, and what happened is you have this limitation over here in Brazil, but what I think is the problem is not clearly defined. What is the I don't know the word in English, is like a scope, is the scope of the contract, like the object, you know. For example, imagine that you rent me a house, and then or something, you know. But when I give you back the object, you want the same object. But I just use no, I can give you any house, any object. No, you need to have this defined. The problem that I see is like a loan should have a non-monetary guarantee, but it should be an alienable guarantee, not your body. Like there are some arguments saying like, oh, but maybe you can just be an indentured servitor for like 7 years and stuff like that, because there are biblical arguments for that. But but in the way like, okay, if you're gonna say that, put in writing. Because if you don't put that in writing, then you just you are opening to a limitless a limitless enforcement of this interest fee, and then you just have like a mechanism for contractual expropriation in this case, and that is what happened here sometimes. Like you just keep putting fees, and people cannot pay because the fees are greater than the salary, you know, than the income.
Yeah, and I think that to me that's just, it's interesting, but it's just it's not that interesting about what a justice-seeking court in a free market libertarian system would do in a case like that. I mean, I don't know. It just depends on so many factors that
over the arbiter most of the time.
But in general, I would say that so let's imagine a case where I take a simple example in my criticism of the block Rothbard idea that if you don't repay a loan, you're committing theft, is that people think that if I don't say it's theft, then that means that if you happen to be bankrupt on the day your loan is due, then you get off scot-free. Like they have no imagination that contracts can have subsidiary clauses and
exactly
and ancillary, either implied or expressly stated. So what you would imagine is it would be like, I loan you $1,000 now, and in exchange, you pay me $1,100 in a year if you own it. But if you don't, then interest accrues at a certain rate in the future until you come into ownership of money or other resources by which you can pay me. Like, so if it takes 10 years to pay off a 1-year loan, then the debtor might owe $10,000, right? But he could pay that out of, like, if he has a house worth $1 million, then he might have to sell the house and pay 10,000 from that. But it has to be defined. It's just that I don't, as a libertarian, I wouldn't have a usury thing where it's too much or excessive, as long as it's clear.
No, it's not about the rate. It's not about how much you're paying interest. It's just like how you write that in a contract, or you have a contract. Like, for example, when I say I think it's enforceable, it's like, for example, you said, oh, the guy can sell the house.
Yeah,
there is not a problem. But if you are bankrupt, you don't have a house to sell. Like, or if you sell, someone else is gonna take the money first. Then you can pay the
correct. Yeah, I think of this almost like the ink blot argument that Robert Bork made about how you can't enforce natural rights in the 9th Amendment because it's not clear what it means. And so it would be like if someone spilt an ink block on it and it says Congress shall make no blank. We don't know what it means, so there's no way to enforce it. And likewise, you could say that if someone has a contract, but they're so vague about what the terms are that no court or legal community or community outside the court knows who owns what, then it's just effectively, it's not an effective contract. It doesn't do anything because no one knows what it says. And again, this comes back to the issue that any contract has to be the communication by language of consent by the owner. Exactly. And it has to be sufficiently clear so people know who owns what. That's all.
Can I break in here?
Yeah, go ahead.
We seem to have divorced this conversation from the marketplace and entrepreneurship and specifically competition, which I call the universal solvent.
Yes.
You're both discussing problems in writing a contract so a bad thing doesn't happen or things that is undesirable. And we may not be, the three of us may not be able to come up with that solution, or maybe we will. But But in the real, we could be accused of simply engaging in ivory tower rationalism here.
Correct.
How does it get from here or from the journal article that one of you may write or whatever, an article, a post on a website? How does it get from there to the ground? Correct. And I'm wondering if there's a missing link, and I'm wondering whether a name we should invoke here is David Friedman, because I came up through the Rand and then Rothbard ranks. So that's my orientation. Friedman, we always knew about Friedman, and he was very different from that. But I'm more and more appreciating the link that he's providing.
Yeah.
Since he talks about the market for law, something Murray doesn't talk about, maybe that's the answer. It's not a specific answer because how do we the three of us may come up with a specific answer to Andre's question here. But who cares? So if the three of us think it's
No,
that perfect libertarian solution, but no one else cares.
By the way, I completely agree with you, and that's why I've become increasingly reluctant and skeptical of this idea of these hypothetical issues, because the hypothetical issues, you can never provide enough context to answer it from your armchair. And so the answer is you have to have the general set of principles, and to the extent the society is just, then you're going to have some practical system that generates the outcome, and we can't predict ahead of time what that would be. And so I think I totally agree with you. I don't know what the answer is in these cases. I just think the general principles are what has to guide us, and hopefully they permeate society enough that they go into the courts and people make up. And by the way, no, it's literally impossible for any contract to ever be complete. It's impossible because there's an infinite number of. It will be inefficient to try. That's why at a certain point in time, people put as many clauses as they can, but then they finally put in there an arbitration clause saying, and if we can't come to a decision, we got to give it to someone who make a decision, and that guy might have to just, he might have to roll the dice, because there might be, and by the way, that risk is worth taking in most contracts. It's like, okay, in the very minuscule chance that I'm going to get stiffed because we can't imagine what's going to happen, then I still think it's a contract worth going into ahead of time.
You know, as I understand it, during that, in the time of the law merchant, right, in the Middle Ages, there was no appeal. They all agreed there wouldn't, because they didn't want to take the time.
Right.
I'll just make a ruling and move on. It's not worth it.
A lot of arbitrations like that too. But if the stakes are smaller, it's not worth it to. That's why people do things by hand track, because it's not worth to get a lawyer and to draft it. They're willing to take that tiny risk that something might happen, because in most cases it doesn't. And by the way, reputation, of course, is going to play a bigger role in this anyway. If you want to have repeated business in the community, have a reputation, you're going to bend over and make things right for the guy anyway. You're going to work out a reasonable compromise or something.
That's a big.
I own an arbitration chamber, so yeah, I know how to solve these problems most of the time. But that is the point that I'm saying. Like, when you start to alienate unalienable things, I forget the word, then you have a real problem, because not arbitration cannot solve it, but you cannot measure it in a form of pricing. You know, you cannot. Right. There is a problem. So how much is the limit if you don't set a limit? How much is a life worth? You know.
But by the way, people that engage in negotiation contracts, they're aware of the fact that value is subjective, and they're aware that you can only measure things quantitatively in money terms. And they're aware that there's subjectivity even in the judge or the arbitral community. That's why a lot of times in contracts, they put what's called a liquidated damages clause. So they just say, listen, I don't really know how much it's going to cost me if you don't sing at my daughter's, if you're like Madonna, you're supposed to sing at the, it's an old example, but you know, some popular singer, you're paying $1 million to sing at the Super Bowl. And if you don't show up, I don't really know how much it's going to damage me, but I'm going to put a $10 million liquidated damages clause. And that's just what it's going to be. But the problem is the courts won't enforce those, because they call them punitive, and they say, oh, it's up. That's punitive, and that's the job of the criminal law, which the state monopolizes. So the state just won't give us total freedom of contract. But if you had total freedom of contract, people would come up with ways to solve these problems. They would buy insurance, right? They would rely on reputation. They would have an arbitration clause saying, we will agree, if we can't agree, to go to arbitration with no appeals, because it's just not worth it to go beyond that. Well, one bite at the apple, and then that's it.
Yeah, the only appeal that you have is like if there is a problem with the arbitration, for example, the partial arbiter or something like that, or
a biased arbitrator. But even then, the arbitration agency has a reputation to look out for if they start doing that kind of stuff. They're not going to be chosen in the future. So.
Yeah, no, I know it's like that is one of my trades. So, but the main point is like, what I think is the main problem today that we have is this matter is not common, because you have interference of the state to keep the Federal Reserve, the central banking system, all these kinds of stuff need a way to expropriate people by creating debt, by printing money, doing all this kind of stuff. And loans, in my view, is a way like loans can be legit, but the problem is they can be corrupted to let's say they can be used in bad faith. So the main problem that I see is like there is not today a differentiation over this kind of loans, like the predatory loans, let's say, but it's not about the interest rate or if it's compound or simple rates. It's just about the guarantees that you give, because you told about the one, what is it called, the liquidation clause that you told. If the singer do not show up, this does not make any sense on a loan, because how can you liquidate someone, for example, in a monetary value, as they are taking a monetary value because they don't have it? So that is a problem. Is a contradiction. Does not make sense, like in this way. For example, I cannot pay you because I don't have the money. Okay, if you don't have the money, then you pay me this money, but I don't have the money to pay you. How am I gonna pay you? So, so it's self-defeating in this way.
My suspicion is that in a free market, you would have the effective market-based equivalent of bankruptcy, because just like in some loans now, there's what's called a non-recourse loan. I think my friend Doug French wrote a book called Walk Away. Like there are some, like if I borrow money to get a mortgage to buy a house, if it's a non-recourse loan, then the lender's only recourse is against the value of that property. It's defined, it's definite, it's clear. But if the market falls and it's not there's not enough collateral to pay them back, then they lost on that loan, and they move along. And I have a feeling that if you had a company that tried to be too draconian and get every little bit of money out of you till the end of your days, even though they'll never get fully repaid, instead of just finally writing it off and calling it a loss at a certain point, they wouldn't do good business. I mean, I think at a certain point in time, you have to let market pressure and customs and the reputation of the lender is going to affect the way that loans are collected. So maybe we've done as far as we can do on this. We've been speaking 2 hours, and I'll let you guys, if you guys want to say anything else, we can, but I think we should kind of wrap it up because we probably all have places to go.
I don't think that so much, because if that, like, it's true, yes, the market can correct itself, but if you have these interferences in these non-properties, let's say these things that are not property, they are not just, they are not proper to have, but being considered right or anything like that, you have a distortion, and this distortion can mount up and maybe, let's say, exploding to or imploding to a state in some way to transform this kind of corruption into something erga omnes in this case. But yeah, and about the discussion before about discrimination and freedom of speech and reputation, you don't. I have a small contribution. I don't know if it's a contribution, but if you guys agree, but yeah, you don't own your reputation. Your reputation is something that other people have over you. You know how they recognize you. But discrimination, if they are in a way of, for example, Sheldon gave an example using calling someone a child molester, a pedophile. This is a fake accusation of a crime. So the guy who called me a pedo, for example, he needs to prove that I am that. They cannot just tell that I'm a criminal without showing the proof. Like he has a burden of proof. So if he cannot show that, or I think you are entitled to compensation. For example, okay, you thought that I am a criminal. Show me that I'm a criminal. Like
why couldn't you argue that people listening to this guy make that accusation have the right to trust his accusation or to do their independent research? In other words, why couldn't you say...
they can do it, but the problem is when I tell that you are a criminal, I'm making an allegation of a wrong deed that you made. That is the main problem. I see it's like some things that you need to prove and some things that you say you don't even need to prove. For example, if you don't say like there is a causal necessity or like a necessity to prove, then threats will not be an aggression, because threats are just speech in this way. Like,
Well, I would say a threat is a communication of a communication about what one intends to do with one's actions that other people are entitled to take into account in determining whether you're going to do
exactly.
it and
And
how
that can be
how
real.
to respond.
Yeah, and that can be real or just a bravado, just like a fake threat. For example, if you don't stop smoking your pipe right now, I'm gonna fly over there and make you stop. Like, yeah, that's nothing like does not even make sense, you know. But I see for a false accusation, someone needs to prove the accusation. They can say
Okay.
allegedly.
Well, hold on. But okay, but hold on a second. So in the case of a threat, clearly there's a gray area between a clear threat and something that's not a threat, and then there's a judgment call by the legal system as to how to determine whether there was an actual threat made in a given case. But
Yeah,
we all agree if there's a threat, what you're doing is you're giving rise to the right to respond on the part of the victim, because otherwise the aggressor might actually
yeah,
harm
like,
his,
for example, I
harm
told
his,
you
harm his
stop smoking,
property.
I'm gonna beat you, and you don't consider it a real threat
Right.
because you're in Brazil.
Right,
but
but
then I just show up in your yard. What are you gonna
right,
do?
right. But if I say that, if I say you're a criminal, it's just a statement of my opinion or a fact. Other people don't have to act on that. They're in other words, if
They
you say
need
that,
to,
if you
but
say I have to prove it, then I think you are implying there's a reputation right, which does justify a form of defamation law.
yeah, like I'm not saying that there is a right for your to your reputation, but if someone accuses you of a crime, they should have the burden of proof is on them.
Okay, saying but I don't know if you mean the burden of proof in an argument, or you're saying that if they don't satisfy the burden of proof, then they've committed a crime. Because if they committed
don't satisfy, like if I'm a criminal and they say, oh, you are a criminal and here is the proof, no problem, then you're just stating a fact.
No. But what if I lie and I say you are a criminal, and I refuse to justify my assertion?
Oh, I see. You can just sue the guy and say, okay, prove that I'm
but so then you do
because you
believe
are accusing me. I'm just suing you for like I'm doing you a favor.
but accusing
you know?
accusing is not a threat. Accusing
No,
is just
I'm just saying, like, if that is not a problem, then I don't see why a threat would be such a problem, because people can say like, oh, I was not talking, I was not stating a fact.
But because the threat is the threat to do something you don't have the right to do. We all agree with that. But
yeah, but
lying is just stating a falsehood. I mean, I think you have to either accept reputation rights or not. I mean, it's one way or the other.
And I don't say that you have a right for what people think about you, but I say like you should not be charged, not charged. What is the name? Someone
Accused.
spread a lie, accused for a crime that you don't did. Like if they are accusing you, so okay, prove it. You know.
Yeah, but when you say prove it, what you're saying is you don't have the right to make that accusation if it's false, because
you have the right to make the accusation. But the point that I'm saying, like, you should have the you as the accused the guy, you are being accused, you should have the right to tell the guy, okay, so let's start a litigation. You prove that, no problem. Because
we might disagree with that, because and Sheldon and I and that's another topic.
That is
defamation.
another matter. It's
yeah,
a
that's
long
defamation.
matter. That is
that's
why I put my foot in this one, because I knew that it would be a real fight. But yeah, but I think like if the guy just they don't accuse you, how you can defend yourself? Just say I didn't do it, and the guy like, oh, he definitely did it. Okay, let's put it in the table.
I think it's like what Sheldon said earlier. It's a reputational thing. It's like if you go around making accusations, then your reputation is going to suffer.
But I wonder can have a remedy that's not based on ownership of reputation. I see there's a problem with you own your reputation because it's another lines. So Rothbard convinced me of that a long time ago. But what I'm wondering about, and I'm only wondering because I don't have the answer, is there a way to justify legal action by this person who's been lied about that doesn't entail ownership of reputation?
Well, what could it be? It seems to me they go hand in hand.
Because I think such a monstrous thing could happen, right? Picture a guy who's a teacher or a clergyman, and somebody maliciously spreads falsely the word that he's a pedophile. I mean, There've been
Yeah,
suicides.
it's
Over.
like externality. He's using his body to cause harm in some way. Like he's
Yeah, but
using his.
okay, but harm is not a crime in libertarianism. Causing
I
harm is not
know,
a crime.
but
It's only
I know
aggression
that.
that's.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
I'm
because it's impression. But
this scenario. It just makes me wonder: is there a way consistent with libertarian rights?
Well, I could imagine. So here's something I imagine. I imagine market-based solutions, reputation-based, and market solutions. So, for example, under today's system, libel is a crime, or it's at least a cause of action, and because of that, it actually gives libel more potency because people assume that if you make a dangerous accusation against someone, that is true because they wouldn't do that under that penalty. In other words, they assume that if you're accused of being a pedophile, if you don't sue someone for libel, then you're admitting that it's correct. If there was no such thing as libel law, then no one would give it a default presumption of truth in the first place because they know that you have that option to sue for libel because you don't have that option to sue for libel. So I think that libel laws actually make libel more potent now in a society with.
Sure, Rothbard did argue that, and
In a society, yeah, he did. And in a society with no libel, what I could imagine arising is someone's accused of something, and then you hire some agency to vet it, and and if the guy doesn't go into like a private forum to defend what he said, then he would be kind of basically ostracized by everyone. Like he would have a bad social credit rating in effect. He's a liar. So you would have a penalty that would be paid, not only informally by having the reputation of being someone who runs around crying wolf all the time, but there could be agencies that, they say, look, we'll investigate this and we will put our reputation on the line saying, this guy that was accused of being a pedophile is not, and the other guy's a liar unless he can prove. Now you put the burden.
yeah, you put the burden of proof on him.
You put it on him, but just by social pressure and just by the threat of sort of ostracism and by reputation being ruined.
As part of your protection agency, an insurance clause that if I'm ever the victim of malicious lies, this company will set up a forum, invite that person to come and demonstrate it. And if that person doesn't come, that's bad for him. It's bad for him.
Absolutely. And people don't think of these solutions now because they can go to the courts and use a libel case. But if there wasn't libel law, then maybe things like that would emerge as sort of quasi judicial forums to defend, to rehabilitate someone's reputation. You have the right to
call the guy, and if I would say, like, if the guy just don't show up, then how can I say, or he shows up and he cannot prove that, you can even set up some kind of compensation or something like that. But it would be more like agreement.
And maybe employers would say, listen, I want everyone to sign on this petition saying I'm an innocent victim of libel, and this guy needs to apologize or put up or shut up. And I think maybe everyone should agree not to hire him, not to sell him a house, not to live next to him.
Fiscal removal, so to speak.
Yes.
Again, to invoke David Friedman, the libeler presumably has a protective agency, and the victim has a protection agency. So those agencies already have a contract.
Correct.
And they've agreed that they'll go to the XYZ arbitration if ever they have client in contract.
Yeah, I'm tending now to agree with you guys.
Yeah, there's ways we can work these things out with.
You cannot enforce the guy into sue you. Yeah, that's true. Like the main point that is like, okay, if you're accusing me, prove it. Then you show like proof. Because if you had a proof against me that I'm a criminal, that I'm a crook, and you feel so confident that you can say that out loud, that I will not, let's say, pop you. Why you don't do that on court?
Well, not only that, you could make this would be a stretch maybe, but you could make the argument that if you actually have proof or evidence that I am a pedophile, which could be used to convict me in some kind of private criminal court, right? And if you refuse to do it, you're sort of aiding and abetting me. Now you're on.
Exactly. That is my point. Why you are helping me to be a criminal? That is why I say, like, you should have the. I'm implying that you should have the way to sue the guy to sue you. Because if you don't accept that, he's in contradiction. He's helping me to go scot-free.
We have how he's helping them. I mean, he's bringing this forward. How is he helping? the alleged pedophile.
Well, we have a soft version of this now. When someone makes an accusation to someone, then the guy that's on the other side, someone will you'll sometimes challenge him to a debate. Well, then let's have a debate about it, and then you can prove it there. And it's sort of like in the old days of dueling. Like you insulted my honor.
Duels need to come back.
yeah, dueling needs to come back. Yeah, we should definitely legalize dueling again.
If I'm not mistaken, they're legal in Uruguay.
All right.
But
well, guys,
have a lot of limitations.
I think we should probably wrap it up here. Sheldon, I appreciate your time jumping on here. It's kind of ad hoc and impromptu, but it's good talking to you again.
Yeah, no, this has been great fun.
And Andre enjoyed it too, so maybe we'll do it again.
I enjoyed too. Thanks for your time, Mr. Kinsella. Nice to meet you, Sheldon. If you can send me your email or any way to get in contact, I would love to talk with you. And Mr. Kinsella, I think at this point you just like helped me to push forward with my point against usury, because I think I need to state it more clearly. Like for me, it's clear in my head, but yeah, maybe I need to make an international case in this case. I'll try to translate my stuff. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, guys, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. We'll be in touch later.